Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Eduard's 1/48th scale Spitfire Mk.Vc Trop. This has got a very interesting scheme, so I hope you enjoy. So then, to get this one going, we're going to be starting off by having a look in the cockpit. Specifically, as you can see on screen, I'm going to be having a look at both of the sidewalls. These don't need too much work, however, you can see that I'm having to bolt on one or two different pieces like throttle control columns, trim wheels, etc. just to build them up. Having a look at the rear bracing here, this is going to require a couple of little pieces to be bolted on to allow me to, later on down the line, secure the seat into position. All of these parts on this rear bracing and also on the sidewalls had some excellent locating pins, meaning that fitment was not an issue. Speaking of the seat, here it is being built up. You can see that there is the main back piece and then the two sidewalls kind of slot onto that in a very simple slotting mechanism. Onto yet another sub-assembly. Here you can see me putting together the floor of the Spitfire. This is where all of the control leads, I'd imagine, went for the rudder controls and also control column to make it actually move. Anyway, with that out of the way, we can get on to the first bit of paint for this build, and that is going to be priming everything in Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 Grey. After allowing a suitable amount of time for the primer to dry, I could then put on the first colour, and that is going to be Mr. Colour's C340. Although it does not say it on the tin, I personally find this to be a rather good match for the RAF interior green. Let me know what you think of the colour down below, or what do you personally use, but this was sprayed down onto all of the interior parts in a very uniform coat. After masking off all the designated areas within the cockpit, they could receive a misting of Mr. Metal Colours 211, which is a chrome silver. This was thinned down about 50% using Mr. Rapid Thinner. I have discussed this in a previous video, but I'm finding that Mr. Rapid Thinner helps to get a more shiny appearance. But then once it had dried, the masking tape can be removed in a very satisfying manner, and then we can move on to doing some detail painting. In regard to detail painting, what I initially did was blocked out certain areas using AMOMIG's matte black. This was items such as the trim wheel, parts of the control column, and so on. And then what I could do is I could switch brushes to a slightly finer headed one and start doing the itsy bitsy details. To do this, I was using colours like red, as you can see on screen, some metallic colours, and more. Once I was suitably happy and also the paint had dried, we could start to put some of them together. This included cementing both of the sidewalls to each side of the fuselage. I found these to be very easy to install as they almost slot into place. Some plating can be cemented to the back of the seat, and then this assembly can be cemented to the current assembly of the floor. One thing to note is it isn't the most positive fitment here, as in it almost slides into place and that's it. So potentially do some dry fitting here just to make sure that you're 100% comfortable with where the seat's going to sit. There was no pun intended there, I promise. With my inability to go through a video without making a joke out of the way, we can continue on to having a look at some of the included photo etch. The kit includes one complete coloured photo etch fret. This includes details for, of course, the control panel, seat belts, and there is a plethora of other little bits and bobs to enhance your Spitfire if you feel the urge to. With the last bits and bobs of the main build-up of the interior now being cemented into place, I could then unify the finishes of the interior by giving it a healthy coating of VMS's satin varnish. As you can see, this pretty much just unifies the interior paint. Now to bring out some more details which are moulded into the sidewalls, I'm going to be doing some dry brushing. To do this, I'm going to be using the dust oil brusher and quite intensely scrubbing it onto all of the black elements inside the cockpit. This will just bring out any of the raised details and just gives another dimension to the paintwork. I can now cement the seat into position. This was a little bit fiddly, so take your time here, as this assembly is rather fragile, but it does slot into place after a bit of fiddling. And then I encountered a small issue. The seatbelts was meant to thread through this gap, as you could see, however it was fully moulded in. So what I ended up doing was getting my snips out, snipping them in half and gluing them on either side. It was quite an easy fix in the end, however it did make me scratch my brain a couple of times. With that hurdle jumped, I could then cement the control panel into place, and then the rudder pedals could follow. Before I close everything up, here is just a quick clip showcasing the cockpit, as I didn't take any photos of it, and after I cement the fuselage halves together, I don't think we'll be able to see much of it ever again. This little piece which I'm putting together on screen is actually the locating slot for the rear tail wheel. From what I remember, it is not the most obviously pointed out in the instructions, so make sure you don't miss it, otherwise that might be a little bit of a ball ache. The final thing to do on the interior is cement this front bulkhead into position, and then we can sandwich the two fuselage halves together. The reoccurring theme here is great fitment. Once again, there was no real big gaps which has to be sorted out. Of course, there were some seams, but that was somewhat inevitable on every aircraft kit. So it did mean that I could just steam on ahead with the rest of the build. Initially, I spent some time cementing on parts onto each side of the fuselage and just building it up, before then turning my attention to the wings. The wings and wheel well are built up of quite a few parts, to say the least, meaning that it is rather complex. Perhaps not as complex as Mini-Art's P47, but definitely getting that way. I found that dry fitting was absolutely essential here, as there were so many pieces which all had to be exactly in place, and they all definitely did affect each other's fitment. So take your time here, read the instructions, don't make any silly errors. Somehow I managed to get through it unscathed, which is rather unlike me. Perhaps the holiday did me some good, and you'll be absolutely fine. Once they are all secured and built up, the upper half of the wing can now join the lower half of the wing, and if you've done everything well, you should have absolutely flawless fitment. Luckily for me, this was the case. Now having a look on the upper half of the wing, these cannon covers have to be cemented to each side. They have some great fitment as well. However, I did find that I had to sand one down a little bit, as it was protruding up from the surface just a little bit too much. And then the wings can be joined with the fuselage with relative ease. What I did find, and you can see on this clip here, is I'm having to do a little bit of bending and a little bit of massaging, let's just say, into place. However, with a little bit of persistence and being very, very careful, I did manage to get it into place with a nice fit. Now I can turn my attention to the rear half of the Spitfire. Specifically, you can see me cementing the horizontal stabilizers into position, and then these are swiftly followed by the elevators. The rudder then follows suit, and then I can flip it over and actually cement the included control rod, which sits just underneath the elevator. Bringing it back to the wings now, I can push the wingtips into place. This really does cement the elliptical wing shape of the Spitfire, and I must say, it looks very, very good indeed. Elevators slot into each side of the wing. One thing I would say here is they can't be positioned, which left me a little bit disappointed, but maybe that's just me getting a bit greedy. The aerial can be cemented into position. A small thing here is it has a really nice long locating pin, which I personally love. It just means that I'm not going to knock it off as easily. I say as because I'm still like a bull in a china shop with these things sometimes, so yeah, as. Moving on to the rather distinctive chin of the Mark V, it is built up of two pieces, and then this rear piece just slots into it, which is fine, it works very, very well. However, it does leave you with this rather nasty seam going down the middle of it, and it did take me probably the longest on the entire model to sort out cleanly, and I'm still not 100% happy with how it came out, but there you go. Having a look at the underwing radiator here, it is built up very, very normally, I guess is the best way to say it. I don't think I've ever seen a manufacturer do it any other way than this way, and there's a reason for that. It works very, very well. Having a look at the cannons, you might notice that one of them is filled in. For Scheme A, which is the one that I'm doing, that is what you had to do. I could then use the kit supplied mask to mask off all of the glass in the kit. Good thing to note is all of the glass is nice and transparent. Once it had all been masked off, I can then give the entire Spitfire a generous coating of Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 Black. This showed up any of the imperfections. As I previously mentioned, there were quite a few on the chin of the aircraft. However, after about 2 or 3 passings, I had it all cleared up. Now here is a little overview of the scheme which I'm going to be doing. As you can see, it is its beautiful Mediterranean blue colour for most of the top side, and then on the underside it is this kind of unknown light blue colour. And that is what I'm going to be attacking first. The colour which I chose for this specific colour is actually Mr. Colour C314, which is an Israeli aircraft camo colour, I believe. What I'm first going to be doing with this colour is pretty much black basing. So black basing is quite a common technique nowadays. I've seen quite a lot of modelers use it, and if you didn't know, the technique pretty much entails this. You take your designated colour, which in this case is that sky blue colour, and what you do is you mottle it in the middle of all of the panels. When I say mottle, I mean pretty much create an irregular paint flow. Once you've done this, you should be left with a black boundary along most of the panel lines. This pretty much means when you come in with your uniform layer, as you can see on screen now, it will highlight all of these panel lines and give this almost weathered and stressed paint look. And that pretty much sums up black basing. I think it is a great entry level technique as it brings some visual interest into your models, but at the same time it really does improve your airbrush control skills. However, I'm going to try and take it just that little step further. So to do this, I'm going to try and utilize this weird little thing which I'm holding in my hand, and if you didn't know, this is called an airbrush stencil. And these are pretty much just stencils with super irregular shapes kind of carved into them, which you can then replicate onto your model. And what I'm doing is I'm spraying a very highly diluted white paint through this stencil onto pretty much every surface of the underside. What I hope this stencil will do is once I've done all the techniques on top of this, when you're still looking really close at that paint, you'll see still loads of irregular shapes and hopefully just give something underneath all the shading which I'm going to do. Speaking of shading, while I've got white in the airbrush, I might as well put all the highlights onto the aircraft. When I'm highlighting the underside of this model, I'm pretty much just trying to pick out all of the visual areas of interest for me. So that includes all of the rivet lines on the leading edges, you know, going around some of the major panels which would get the most use, and just trying to break up the surface. I find wings for me are one of the hardest parts of the aircraft to look interesting, just because they're big and they're flat and sometimes they don't have many panels on them. Lucky for me, this Spitfire is absolutely oozing with details, so I was having an absolute whale of a time going around figuring out different ways to pick them out. I found for me the best way to do this was put areas which are lighter next to areas which I've just made a little bit darker. And what this naturally does is create contrast, and where there's contrast it usually pronounces details just that little bit more. Once I've done all this shading, I will continuously blend it back in very thin coats until I am happy, and this was the final result. And I personally think it worked very well. It's a technique which I personally haven't tried out before, which is why I did it on the underside first, but now that I knew that it had worked, I was ready to push on to the top side. When looking at the history of this scheme, I found out that this Mediterranean blue was actually superimposed by US troops on USS Wasp. So someone down at my local model shop gave me the great idea to show parts of the paint worn down to show the underlying and original paint scheme of the Dark Earth and Middlestone. Kits like this Spitfire are hidden gems. The box art looks cool, but it's not until you open up the box and look inside that the real story of the airframe can be revealed. This is why I love my local model shop, Hannets London, so much. It is a rare sighting of a real physical model shop which you can go in and physically pick up kits and have a look inside them. As well as this, they are staffed by some of the most knowledgeable modelling men in the world, so if you have any questions, I'm positive they'll be able to help you out. Their details are on screen now, so be sure to check them out, and I hope to see you down there soon. Continuing on with the paintwork, here you can see that I've just pretty much repeated the exact steps which I did on the underside, but this time altered the colours a little bit and just applied them to Middlestone and Dark Earth. There's nothing much else to it. Here you can see me just blending in that Middlestone to lessen the effect and make everything look a little bit more natural. And here was the final result. I must say, at this stage I was a little bit annoyed that I wasn't doing a full tropical scheme. I was absolutely chuffed with how that paintwork came out. However, I had to push on. Here on screen you can see me getting the diameter of the roundels for this aircraft. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to get my Display circle cutter and then cut out masks of that exact size. I did actually make them a little bit bigger, and the reason for this is I wanted to leave an area of that Middlestone and Dark Earth showing to show that it's almost fading around the roundels and that the guys on USS Wasp hadn't painted over the roundels. I also did this on the rear where the registration of the aircraft was going to go. I could then spray the rest of the areas in a generous coating of AK's heavy chipping fluid. After I had left it to dry, it did leave a weird kind of residue around, however I ignored that as it was going to be painted over, and then I could crack on with that Mediterranean blue. And the colour which I'm going to use for that is Mr. Colour's C328, which funnily enough is the US Blue Angels colour. This was sprayed onto the aircraft in a uniform coat. I didn't do black basing here as there were aspects of the dark brown and the middle stone which I thought would have altered with the tone in a way which I didn't really want it to. You could also see me there not really spraying over the middle stone and dark earth sections, only a little bit along some of the panel lines, and the reason behind that is I didn't want to do too much chipping if I didn't need to. If I knew those areas I wanted the paint below to show, what was the point in spraying the blue over it? In terms of how I'm spraying the paint, I'm spraying at 1 bar or about 15-16 psi, and I've diluted that paint with 60% thinner and 30% paint. Once everything was suitably blue, I was ready to start ripping the paint up and making it look absolutely battered. The general process which I'm going to use here doesn't differ too much from the underside and also the other aspects which I have painted. It just has a couple of little tweaks here and there. Initially starting with the airbrush stencil being used to break up the underlying paint texture, and while the white is still in the brush, I'm going to use it just to highlight some of the panels and also the control surfaces and just do what I've been doing before. What I did do on the upper surfaces is I thinned my paint 10% more, so it actually ended up being about 80% thinner and 20% paint. And the thinner which I'm using is rapid thinner because for post shading and in applications like this, it works so well. After I had done all the highlights, and you might also be able to see I've done some of the shading as well with a darker paint, I'm now going to be using Mr. Color's C122 and C392 just to create some more shades of that blue colour. On the underside I only used 2 colours, white and that kind of sludgy brown colour. However, the more colours that I use up here, the more tones that I'm going to get. And what I wanted on here was so many different shades of blue. I wanted it to look like I've used every single blue on the planet, and I think once I start to blend it in, which is what I'm doing here, you'll start to see all these different tones come out and how well the effect has actually worked. I hope you can see here as I'm starting to now blend everything in how thin my paint mixture actually is. And the reason behind this is I just spent quite a few hours doing all of these different techniques, and I really didn't want to lose the effect any more than I had to. It did end up taking probably about twice as long to build up the final tone, but I think it was a well-made sacrifice because this meant I was in complete control over that final effect, and I think it came out quite nicely. Now that you can see I've removed the masking from the roundels, they worked quite nicely as well, very subtly blended in, and at this point I was happy that I could also remove the masking tape, protecting the underside. It was now time for what I was most excited for, and that was going to be doing a lot of chipping. So, to activate the chipping fluid, what you need to do is get a clean brush doused in some warmish water and initially just brush it over the area which you want to be chipping on. Once you've let it soak into that layer, just for a little bit, you can start to scrub away. What the warm water does is it actually breaks down the chipping fluid, and with it, it breaks down that top layer, giving you these very, very realistic chips and scratching effects. The first 10 minutes of chipping were just by using this brush. The brush is great for getting rid of lots of chips and it does look very, very authentic. However, when I thought it was just getting a bit too much, I switched over to my skewer and then it gave me far more control. It was literally just like using a pencil and just scraping along the lines where I wanted there to be chips. If I wanted an even more intense chipping effect, what you can do is use multiple layers of chipping fluid. Because I only used 2 layers of chipping fluid here, the effect wasn't too strong, but if I'd used 3 or 4, all of that paint literally would have just flown off of the aircraft. After leaving it to dry out for a little bit, I came back and I was really happy with how it was looking. I do think that this was a great addition to the model. It pretty much just gives the model a focal point rather than it being a very blue Spitfire, and I'm very happy that I made the choice to do it. After I let it cure overnight, I gave the entire aircraft a coat of GX100, which was a great base for all of the decals. The decals went down okay. I'm not completely happy with how they all setted in. Even using Mr. Mark Setter and Softer, I struggled to get a couple of them to fully indent into the recesses. And I think that might be because I went a bit too heavy on the gloss coat, filling in quite a few of the details, which is rookie error to be honest, but there we go. I'll make sure for next time I don't do that. Whilst waiting for the decals to dry and do their thing, I thought it would be a good opportunity to paint up the exhaust stacks. Initially, I based them in Mr. Color C61, which is a burnt iron colour. I could then come in on top with a track wash, and what this was just going to do is bring a bit of warmth into that burnt iron colour, as it was looking a bit cold and a bit too pristine as well. After using a heat gun to speed up the drying process, I was ready to add a little bit more weathering on top of this, utilising a dust oil brusher. I'm just going to splodge some dollops of that dust onto the base of all of the stacks, and this kind of gives the effect of a bit of a soot build-up right at the base of all of the exhaust stacks. Once that had dried, I could then go on to add the final little touch for these exhaust stacks, and that is using rust orange and putting it onto the spine of each of the stacks. What this was going to do is pretty much almost just add some saturation into them and just add a bit more colour, as at the moment they were very kind of rusty brown looking, and a bit more orange just made them pop that little bit more, and it's exactly what they needed. They could then be secured onto the aircraft, and they were fitted on using some ultra glue, which just made sure that they had a nice secure fit. It was at this point that I was happy that the decals had dried. I was not completely happy with how they had settled, but it was going to have to do as they weren't getting any better. So I re-glossed the entire aircraft, and then I gave the underside a ground brown wash. I did apply a wash to the upper surfaces, however it didn't really show up at all, and that is just due to the very dark nature of that colour. So continuing on with the weathering of the underside, I mixed up this kind of dirty, oily, grimy colour in my airbrush. I wish I could give you exact ratios, but I'm not completely sure. And I airbrushed them into the brief shapes of the oil stains, which would be on the underside of the Spitfire, and also any grime coming out of the wheel bay. To further enhance this effect, I'm going to be using oil brushes. I'm going to use Starship Filth and also black. I'm going to mainly use the black to create the streaks, and then I'm going to come in with the Starship Filth to create some grimy panels and just change the tone of a couple of panels to look like they've recently had oil spills on them or have just had a huge sediment buildup. I'd like to mention here that all of these oils are being dry blended in, so that means that I'm not using any white spirit to blend them in. And the reason behind this is if I'm using white spirit, it usually gives a bit more of a streaky appearance, where in this case I just kind of wanted to have gradients between the panels. And once I finish up dirtying up the gun bays and also the wheel wells, that about finishes up the underside in terms of weathering. This was one of the more intense weathering jobs that I have done on the channel, so let me know, what did you think of it? Did you enjoy this sort of weathering? Do you want to see more of it? Do you want to see less of it? Yeah, please do let me know. Your feedback is always hugely appreciated. Now turning the aircraft onto the top, I'm going to repeat these sort of gradiented effects onto the middle stone and dark earth sections of the upper half. I stayed away from mucking around with the Mediterranean blue, mainly because I really liked how it looked, and I didn't really want to muck around with the tones anymore, as I thought it looked good as it was. To then seal in all of the paintwork and the oil work on both sides, I'm going to be using VMS's satin varnish. And then what I'm going to be doing for some more weathering is the exhaust stains. I'm initially using a dirty brown colour. I think I mixed it out of dark earth and also ocean grey, more dark earth than ocean grey. This was sprayed on the vague shape, and then I came in with Tamiya's buff paint and just gave some highlights in the middle of it. Once that was done, I thought it looked a bit one-dimensional, so I actually got the oil brushes back out, Starship Filth to be specific, and then I started to wet blend it in. Using the wet blend, this meant that it was a far more patchy and a far more harsh look, which was exactly what I wanted for this sort of effect. Once it had all dried up, it looks something like this, and as you can see, it just has a bit more texture to it and looks just that tiny bit more realistic. Now the final bit of weathering for this build is going to be using a silver coloured watercolour pencil to create some chips. So I really enjoy using these purely because of the amount of control you have on the size and the shape of them. The colour of them is also brilliant. The one downside which I do have to them, which you have to be really careful of, is their watercolour pencil. So I have somewhat sweaty hands. I mean, everyone has a bit of moisture on their hands, so if you're not careful when you're handling the aircraft, you can actually smudge silver and then it looks absolutely awful. So how I overcome this personally is I have VMS's satin varnish at the ready, and as soon as I've done an area of chipping, I'll very lightly mist over there and it almost secures the chips in. I continue this chipping onto the prop before then going on to the final assemblies. Initially, the wheels are going to be cemented into place. These have great locating pins, however I found the angle of them to be a little bit different between the two of them, so be careful as I kind of got a bit caught off guard here. The tail wheel also slots into place very nicely, regarding that you actually put the locating slot for it in. Now the masking tape can be removed from the canopies. Luckily I had no overspray onto them, which is quite rare actually for me, and they held up absolutely perfectly throughout. So the final pieces now get cemented onto the aircraft is going to be the canopy, the prop, and of course the door. And once they're all on, that about finishes this build up. So thank you very much for watching this video. I really do hope that you've enjoyed it, and maybe enjoyed it as much as I had putting it together. Been a lot of fun getting back into this after my little holiday, but don't worry, I am well and truly back and I'm ready to make a lot of models. So stay tuned for all of them. And without any further ado, enjoy the final photos and videos, and I'll see you next time guys. Bye bye.